we always think, oh, farm women must be closed in the farms. They were working all the time. They couldn't do anything, had no clue what was going on in the world. It's only partly true. And there were lots of people working to, in that sense, empower them.
Hello everyone and welcome to the podcast Digging Deeper by Stichting Boerengroep Wageningen. This podcast explores agroecological practices in the Netherlands and beyond. As part of the agroecology movement, we fight for a radical change towards a socially and ecologically just food system, and do this by giving a platform to farmers, activists, scientists, students and politicians. We invite you to be part of the movement. In this series, we focus on the marginalized communities in the agricultural sector and bring to light the struggles that are often kept hidden. So without further ado, let's start digging deeper together.
Do you want to dig deeper into the wild world of wild plants and foraging? Listen to the Wildpluk podcast. I am Roos Konings and I'm so lucky to share all this wonderful information about foraging, using and growing wild plants. So, check out the podcast for free on your favorite podcast platform.
Our guest in this episode is Margreet van der Burg. She's a historian who specialized in gender studies related to agriculture, and she works as a teacher and researcher at the Wageningen University. This episode is the first of two parts in which we will be talking about the history of women in agriculture in the Netherlands. In the first part, we dive into the segregated agricultural education system, the lack of, or the difficulty to find, female stories and perspectives in agricultural history, and the feminist movement in the 20th century. My name is Matti, and I will be the host of today's podcast. But before we begin, I want to give a little disclaimer that we will be talking in a very binary way when discussing the differences between activities, norms, and rights for men and women in the agricultural sector. As a non-binary person myself, I would like to add a few words here to acknowledge the fluidity of gender and the realities in the past and in the present of genderqueer people on the farmland. If you are interested in this topic, I will add a nice sign into the description and also strongly encourage you to browse the web yourself. For now, let's dive into this conversation. Welcome, Margreet. I'm very excited to be sitting here together with you today and kicking off this very important topic for the first time in our podcast about gender roles in agriculture. You've been active in the field of gender studies for the last 40 years, approximately?
From 1984 onwards.
Yeah, pretty much
right,
40 years.
Right, yeah.
And gender studies in relation to agriculture mainly, and farm women, rural women. And I'm interested to start with, actually, where does your own interest in gender or gender roles come from?
Well, I was a student in the 77 to 85, and it was all buzzing around that there should be other science, that we were not pleased with how it was, and we wanted to know about women, what they were doing. I was by then a history student, and we had nothing about it in our courses. So some students started to claim for that. I think it started in Amsterdam and we wanted to join in. I was in Nijmegen. And actually the turning point was that we, with a group of women historians students, went to Vienna because there was a Historikerinnen-treffen.
Cool. This is the German word for women historians.
And there were lots of countries present, and they reported about the state of affairs in the countries, and there was a lot of nice sessions, all kinds of stories about women I never heard of. So
that's confronting.
That was really getting me in.
Yeah.
And then for agriculture, I noticed I was starting to look around. You had some alternative lifestyles, working with plants in different ways, gardening. And I noticed I never heard anything about agriculture history in Nijmegen. And then all of a sudden I found out I moved a lot. So I was always interested what kind of education I now get again, and what different kinds of education are there anyway, and progressive education or not. And then I found out that there was a special education for farm women and their daughters I never heard of again. And I didn't find a lot of literature about it, so that was my master thesis topic, and decided to do my PhD on it. And so I was caught for agriculture as well.
Yeah. Did you succeed to address this lack in education also at the university? Did things change at the time?
It's an up and down battle. I think when I started with it, it was seen as, oh, it's another education. It's good that this has been addressed, but never from this gender perspective onwards. My chairholder never really presented me as a gender person, but she is doing history of farm household management education, so education for the farm women and daughters. But I wanted more, so I collaborated a lot with the gender studies. That was also up and down battle. And yeah, when I look back now, I am the pioneer of gender and agriculture history in the Netherlands, but I'm now not doing that much anymore. And there are no many other people in universities who do something like that, but it's growing a bit, so I'm still hopeful.
Yeah.
And that is also for the international universities all around the world. When I came visiting one, I was looking for a history department, and they were collecting stories, very nice, and songs, but serious analysis. Often they say, well, we are now working on the future.
Yeah.
To explain every time, why do we need history? But yeah, my point of view is that, especially also from the Western history, if we don't look at them it critically in how we have transmitted our ideas of the history, for instance, the success story of agriculture in the Netherlands was a long time the mainstream history. Yeah, when we don't look at it critically, we never learn from what we are, what we do, and what we should perhaps start to change.
Yeah, instead of running with our eyes closed.
Yeah, and part of it, what I found very interesting, is not only addressing what has happened in facts, but also what debates were there, what was discussed, what did make it, what did not make it.
Yeah.
Because mainstream more or less says that is the majority, but doesn't say that's all. It's not about all the people. It's not about what happened in perhaps side rooms or specific regions.
Yeah.
So I'm very much in favor of a critical perspective on history.
Yeah. This will be a good moment to shortly introduce the two different kinds of education that have been present for a big time in the 20th century in the Netherlands. One of them being the Farm Household Management School, which was the school that rural women were supposed to go to, and then the other one being the Farm School, which was the school where rural men were supposed to go to. And as you can imagine, the Farm Household Management School was focused on family care, on household tasks, and the farm school where the men were supposed to go to was much more focused on the technical side of agriculture, using machinery and so on. Let's take it back to your PhD and your master thesis. You briefly mentioned it. What was this about? What did you write about?
Well, when I talk with other people about agriculture policy, and we wanted to address it from the gender point of view, it was hard to take the agriculture policy because it never says, well, we want to do different things for men or women or whatever. But underneath, there was, of course, a lot. And then I found this education for farm women daughters. And when they established it, they were actually discussing a lot what should it entail. And from that, of course, a lot of people were participating in those discussions. And then you could see all different views of how should the farm woman be in the future. So that, in fact, by giving it a status of education to work towards that, it's a form of agriculture policy.
Yeah. When are we talking about now? What was the time frame?
In the Netherlands, they were discussing it mostly from 1909 onwards, so more than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And of course, it came back several times. It was first education under the Ministry of Agriculture. Then the women who were doing household education were also trying to get it more formalized and to get subsidies, what a farm household management education already got. And they wanted to have farm household management education under the same law, because they were saying, well, household is household. But the agriculturalists and the women teaching in farm household management education, they really expressed there, no, we are different because we are in a rural context, we are working on a farm. For instance, was always nice. They said our women can't afford to fold the sheets so nicely as should be done according to the household, or we don't have the time to make all this kind of puddings and cakes.
Yeah.
So our curriculum must be really different.
Yeah.
And in the end, they stayed separately under the same law, but they kept their own separate status with inspection and curriculum. So and that turned to work until 1968, when we had we call it in Dutch the Mammoet Law, a law that tried to make better crossovers between different types of education, and then they resolve this separateness as well.
Yeah, I see. Could you maybe give a brief description or sketching a picture of the early 20th century in terms of what were women in agriculture struggling with, what were their roles, their activities in farm life?
Yeah, at that time, when you read the reports, it's very important to see that there were different regions, and they were more or less divided by the soil, because that was still an important phenomenon to what you could do with agriculture. So you had very rich farmers, for instance, in the north, in Friesland and Groningen. And Zeeland, on the clay, were very fertile soils. You had most arable lands for potatoes, grains, and in Frisia you had also a lot of dairy cattle. Women were still making. No, they ended to make their own butter at the farm. It more or less resolved to take over by the factories in the 1910s. And then you have regions around the rivers. The river clay, they were very fertile. You had the peat, the former peat areas were still very wet, so they mostly had also cattle. With a history of, for instance, in Gouda and the environment of big cheese making, what also women did from the past, but in Gouda they kept on doing it. The northern, they had smaller cheeses, a bit better. And then you had a lot of sandy soils. They were by then already cultivated, if they were still cultivating. These were more small farmers who had to do anything to keep their heads up. And you can imagine that there's a difference in what women would do on those different farms. that on the small farms, women were a labor force from the morning till the evening because they had to do the children and the household and work in the farm as well. I have a quote from a woman of Drenthe in the late 20s that she said, "I'm the first who wakes up and I'm the last to go to bed." You can imagine. And then she described the whole day what she was doing all the time, running from this to that, to that, to that.
Yeah.
Of course, it was a real relief if the children grew up and then they could help the sons with the father and the girls with the mother. But they could not afford a servant or a maid. And that was different. Division of labor was of course different on the big farms where there were servants and maids. And there was more that the farmer was supervising the servants, the male servants, and the farm woman was supervising the maids. And in bigger farms you had easily more than one, and then you had also kind of career stages of the young girl who came to help, and then older maids or the maids who were helping with the dairying. So that was there were more people working in agriculture, of course, than these days.
And did we then also see a difference between the amount of value that was credited to a certain kind of work or activity on the farm?
Well, of course, the women did not only help in the farm work, and then you have to think about, for instance, if there are small animals like piglets or chickens, or well, mostly they do all the poultry and the pigs as well, the calves and lambs, for instance. Women were doing that. That was more or less around the farm, that they didn't have to go far away. They also, of course, did the household and taking care of the children, making the food. There was also slaughtering of the pig when it was big enough, and to make that into sausages or meat anyway. In that time, the early 20th century, there were also new conservation methods like canning came up really. That was
canning?
Canning
Mm-hmm.
To make pots of glass or tins, but in the Netherlands was more the glass. Wecken, it's the German word for it. And of course women wanted to do that to come through the winter time. We have wonderful quotations again that women were so proud to show to their family or friends, women who came along, how much they had in the cellars to come through the winter time.
Yeah, so that gives a bit of a picture of the activities that female people were mostly responsible for. Yeah,
you asked about the value. It's of course valuable. It's difficult to really judge because you have also a lot of reports and journals writing about the women, that they were not valued enough, especially on small farms who were working from early morning till late evening. And they sometimes call them, it's like the first hand of the farmer, or slavery even. But you have to see that also from the perspective of the bourgeois. So we're not sure. It must have been, but there were of course a lot of people working hard. But the fact is there that in the end, the farmer was seen the head of the household. He was representing the household in public. The women had no real rights, for instance, a divorce or to decide on whether there should be something bought or not. So in that sense, it's of course not equal. And that's quite interesting because a lot of people nowadays say, well, those farm women, they were emancipated. They didn't need to be feminist or whatever. But actually, in the time changing, that political influence was more important, that public services were more important, then you might wonder how that exactly works out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Also, if I'm correct, in the beginning of the 20th century, the bigger international agricultural conferences started to take place, and rural women did for a long time not feel represented or seen within these conferences. And in the 1920s, women's topics started to be taken more seriously in agendas of those conferences. What did this look like? Who came to these conferences, and what were the first female sections, or the first female farmers present at those conferences?
Yeah, actually, that's an interesting international surrounding from the topic. I sometimes describe it this way, that you had the International Council of Women, that were the feminists from the Western world, white feminists mostly. They came together to claim education, professions, labor conditions, payment even. And when I read books about those, they never mentioned that it would be around agriculture or rural women. So I was, okay, feminists didn't think about that. And then I looked at the international agricultural conferences and reports about that, literature, and I didn't see anything about farm women or rural women, or would they be addressed or something. So I thought, oh, they didn't talk about it. Till I could access those transcripts of the conferences through the wonderful internet, has also good sides.
Yes, of course.
And then I found, well, they did talk about it, but those historians didn't mention it. That is kind of strange. And I learned through the years that a lot of historians didn't feel comfortable enough to make this comments on rural or farm women, because they felt that it was so different and they didn't know enough about it, so they just left it out. But for the International Council of Women, they also addressed the profession for women in agriculture, either for farm daughters, and they were thinking mostly of bigger farms, or from women from cities who had to do a kind of feminine job that was acceptable for women of good background. For instance, in dairy or in poultry, to make their own farm. And that also had their effect in Netherlands. Not that much. We were really a more bourgeois culture that didn't. And there were some discussions, and the first feminist of the Netherlands, Minette Storm van der Gijs, wrote a lot about it. Was forgotten also for a long time, so was really detective there. Those international contacts are, of course, somehow also rippling through in the Netherlands. And the agriculture conferences were also talking about education, and so also education for dairying, but also for the broader function of farm women. And there first came up farm household management education to be a good way to not only address farmers who were already getting agriculture education, but also to take in the women. And a famous person who was promoting that was Paul de Vuist. He's from Belgium. They started to have a lot of schools there. And then, of course, some the people of Zeeland and Limburg and Brabant, the southern provinces of the Netherlands, they heard of it. They started to look there and they said, oh, we should do something alike. And at the same time, the feminist movement of the Netherlands was involved as well. So from both sides, it was then discussed, we should do more for women. But I must say that it was mostly meant for the majority, so the women on family farms, and not for women who wanted to farm on their own.
Yeah.
One exception was the school for horticulture in Rijswijk, later led by biodynamic women. They got subsidies also from the state, but after the Second World War, there were some other biodynamic schools taking over, but they were not specific for girls anymore.
Yeah. And then at the start of women attending these conferences and having more attention, it was also still quite segregated in terms of the women's topics were visited by women and the males' topics, workshops, lectures were visited by male people, and there was not so much interchange.
Yeah, you can't look what they do in between of the sessions, but these conferences were really big. Countries until the 1940s from the Eastern Europe were well represented there as well. And they had streams of sessions. You must think on education, extension, but also colonial agriculture was a separate stream, politics. And in the 20s, indeed, they added a stream for question féminine, so women's issues.
Yeah.
And of course, women already working in the education or later on the extension and the farm women's organizations were represented there. But you can imagine that it were mostly the people who could be paid to go there.
Yeah.
Sometimes of the elite or teachers who were up in more leading management functions, but normal farm women were not there. Small farm women were, But they heard of it. They made their own magazines that were also distributed among the pupils, and the pupils were invited to then join the farm women's organizations, and they had their exchanges and excursions. And they also had, when there was a conference and there were foreigners in the Netherlands, they could also come to visit your group. Some people even went from Gelderland to Frisia to stay for some days with the other group on bike in the 1930s,
Wow.
all the way. So, I'm sometimes thought, I never realized, we always think, farm women must be closed in the farms, they were working all the time, they couldn't do anything, had no clue what was going on in the world. It's only partly true. And there were a lot of people working to, in that sense, empower them. But you're right, it was a segregated and restricted option for the farm women in their roles. And that's why I also called my PhD thesis Geen tweede boer. In English, no second farmer. They should be emancipated or empowered to do their job, but they were not supposed to become the farmer or the farmer next to the male farmer.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it might be interesting to tell here that the segregation is, of course, also grounded in that there was a sense of complementarity. The family, is also in religious ways, was man and woman. Mm. And together they made the farm family. And then the man was the head of household, and for instance, Catholics at one time said the woman was the neck. So she was turning to accommodate whatever was needed, and that's really true. So this complementarity is that the men had specific roles and women had specific roles. To some extent that was also in reality. But by formalizing it in education, you only increase this separation and reproduce this separation. And for instance, the men were supposed to do the politics, the economics, and the technical things, and the women were then for the social and the cultural and also the moral. There were lots of sayings about, wow, the woman, if she is home and shapes a wonderful home at the farm, the man would come and not drink anymore. Or she was the one who should take care that the children said their prayers before they went to sleep. Or that there were festivities with a kind of content, not only drinking and partying, but around rituals or address what was to celebrate at a time like Christmas or whatever.
Yeah.
But the social part was also very interesting because the women, through the farm women's organizations, were also called up to help to build medical care in the villages, or having a library, or consultation bureaus later for the first care of young children. So it was not that they were kept in their houses, but specific roles. And where you see the mismatch, I put some examples, is of course first when there was no family. The man or the woman could die, and there you see the inequality, what happened. If the man was dying, the woman took over until the first son could take over. So she did the man's roles.
Yeah.
But when the woman died, the man would never take over, but he asked for the first daughter if she was old enough, or a niece, or an aunt, or even a neighbor, or a paid woman, but he never took over. So there's already a mismatch. It's the same when there's somebody ill, when the man is ill. And where we see also a mismatch is, of course, if women want to be farming. And I found that especially the second daughters were regretting that they couldn't be educated or could be the farmer. And that's interesting to know that nobody did not permit women to go to agriculture education, or even the men to the farm management household education. There was no law, there was no rule, but you didn't do it because what would people say?
Invisible norms, yeah.
Yeah. So those women were regretting it later on, and I found out that there might be a pattern because when I asked about it, they said they were with their father going into the fields. And it seems to be that in a lot of cases, the first girl went with the mother to take care for what she was doing, to support her. But when the father had no son old enough to join him in the work, the second daughter was there. And she was then really into the work, had done it for a long time of her life, and she wanted to continue. So there's also a mismatch that she couldn't do that.
Yeah.
And of course what we see now, because it's still the standard, the family farm, and most of the farms are still family managed, that if we have partnerships of same sex, who's doing what, and how are the people looking at them? So this thinking of complementarity, even in times when it's not fitting, is the standard. And also started to get the segregation working, and by having it segregated, it only reinforced. It's even there are lots of examples that even if the girls and the boys, or the men and the women, used the same school building, they were supposed to not have the breaks at the same time because they could meet. Well, that's nowadays it's impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but it's not long ago. Also.
Yeah, and it's still in the heads of people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think especially also these invisible norms or expectations that you're naming, they're very much still present in the heads of people, even though maybe they're less present in universities now or education now. It's still very much, I think, internalized ways of thinking and these stereotypes of what a female or male farmer is supposed to be doing.
Yeah, and you see it also a lot in compensation behavior. In the 90s, we talked with farm women who were emphasizing that they were women, although they did a lot of farm work in the overalls, to dress up really nice after the work. And a little bit, I think, also these calendars with farm daughters, farm girls who want to be models. Yeah. They don't have to, but they want to show we are also there. We want to belong. We want to be part of this not work life in overalls and dirt and
You wrote a chapter in a book called Focused Gender, where you name the political dilemma of groups having to associate to come out of the margins, but on the other hand, also needing to define and defend their very own voice separately. How do you see that in the movement of rural women in the 20th century? Because you already named them not really fitting in the feminist movement at the time, but also not at the agricultural movement. How does this play out?
Well, the dynamics are really interesting to see because when it was discussed in the Netherlands, for instance, to have a national farm women's organization, the ones who were not religious, they called it denominational. They were discussing with the denominational agriculture organizations, that's now the LTO, that they wanted to suggest to have a separate organization. And then the men were saying, well, that would be okay, but it shouldn't be a feminist one. And then, of course, was the question, what is feminist? And then they gave the example, well, we know from Germany, it was before the Nazi time, there was an organization who were getting houses at the edge of the city where the farmer women could bring the produce they had left over or they had extra, and then the city women could come there and buy it. And then the Dutch farm organization said, well, that's not what we needed. We have our auction and women don't have to bother about the sales of the produce. And it's a way of superiority, but also diminishing the efforts of women in Germany. But they were all right, you can have your organization in this complementary way. But for the religious organizations, like what we still have in Limburg, the LLTB, but then you had the NCB and the ATBTB, and you had also the Christian Protestants organizations. They were thinking, for us, the family is so important, so we can't have the women separately. We want to have them in our organization, but under the same board. So the women could do their thing, but they're always supervised, or the last decision making was on the board of the Farmers Union. Mm. And in, for instance, the Catholic organization, you had a priest who was the spiritual advisor. Mm. He also had to be there with the farm women's meetings. There was mass often in big meetings. And that is the same for the youth as well. You had for young farmers, male and young girls.
And these associations, organizations that you named, they were agricultural organizations or political parties?
No, they were really, that's an interesting question. Yeah, they were really farmers organizations, and they called themselves unions because they want to defend the interest of the group. And But of course, when you have meetings, events, it's also a social way of meeting each other. And but they were, of course, trying to influence the politics. And for instance, Catholic Party, they were real connections. And some people of the same circles went in those political parties. They later called it the Green Front. But the unions themselves were no parties, but they were really high in the lobby.
Influence,
yeah.
yeah.
And that was, of course, more difficult for the farm women because they had always go through the farmers' unions, and they had no ministry to defend their own interests for the women themselves. Yeah. So that was also a kind of disadvantage.
We're cutting the episode here and thanking you for listening to the first half of this conversation. If you're interested in the topic, be sure to check out the second part, where we will dive deeper into the segregated educational system and how this reinforced gender roles within agriculture, as well as taking it to the present context. Also, if you're interested in the work that Margreet is doing, take a look at the links to her publications in the description of this episode. If you want to know more about the Boerengroep Wageningen, the organization behind this podcast, you can find our details in the same description. We're on Instagram, Facebook and LinkedIn, and you can also come to one of our open meetings every other Tuesday or to one of our informal breaks every other Thursday, where we chat and we enjoy drinks together. If you have any questions or if you just want to reach out to this podcast, feel free to send us an email to podcast_diggingdeeper@outlook.com. Thank you for listening and have a nice day.